Is the world real? Is the world unreal? Is the world distinct from consciousness, or is it one with consciousness, or is it something else? Is there free will? Is there no free will? Everything you see is an illusion. The self is not born and does not die. Before the universe was created, you were there, and you gave rise to the entire universe. You are literally God. You are the creator, the sustainer, the destroyer. The self is not born and does not die. Consciousness was there first, and then in consciousness, the world, the body, mind appears and disappears and goes back into consciousness. But ultimately, we will discover there was no universe. There was only that, and you are that. Something that is unreal in the beginning and unreal in the end is also unreal in the middle. That which is unreal never came into being, and that which is real never ceases to be. Either through knowledge or through love and devotion, we turn our attention away from the body, the mind, the world, the thoughts, the sense perceptions, towards this sense within us of I exist or I am. If you investigate, you will discover that which is temporary doesn't exist. You are God. You are that. Tattvamasi. When you go into the deep sleep state, fully conscious, that results in self-realization.
Tom Das is a UK-based spiritual teacher who will point us directly towards the ever-present freedom that is our true nature in this episode. It's really an honor to have you on our podcast Under the Tree today. Thank you so much for being here, Tom.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
To begin this discussion, I would like to start talking about the doctrine of non-origination or ajata, and that's because a lot of our viewers are interested in this concept, what it means. Why, if so, is it the ultimate truth, and how can one practically reach this realization or understand it?
Oh, wow. Gosh, your brother went straight in with a really good question, like getting straight to it. Now you've got in with it too. That's brilliant. Wow. You want to go straight to ajata vada. Okay. Or ajati vada. Okay. Yeah. What do you what do you want to know?
So, my spiritual journey personally started a couple years ago. I was able to actually learn and study with Swami Sarvapriyanandaji, the Mandukya Upanishad. There's with the Gaurapada's Karakas, and there's a specific verse in there, the 7th verse. I'll read a translation from it. Obviously, it's because it's in Sanskrit, so the viewers can kind of get an understanding of the idea of that message. I'd like for you to elaborate on that and non-origination as well. So, I guess that verse essentially says that not inwardly cognitive, not outwardly cognitive, not both, not a cognition at all, not unconscious, invisible, beyond dealings, ungraspable, without characteristics, unthinkable, indescribable, whose essence is the awareness of the self alone, the cessation of the phenomenal world, peaceful, blissful, non-dual, Satchitanand. This is known as the fourth Turiya. This is a self that is to be realized. This is very difficult, I would like to say, for someone who's maybe just heard it to actually understand what it means, because right away, in a way, we are saying the world is false. And I know you will correct this because the
The
world
world is
technically is false, but that is for people who are not able to actually understand the full picture. Because if we are saying that everything is that Brahman all alone, and you can elaborate on this, and where does the world stand? So I've thrown a lot of different things at you right there, but I think you're able to understand where I'm going at. Because for me, this was a big paradigm shift to first think that this world alone is real. Everything here is real. How we look, the amount of money we earn, what we want to do in life, our careers, relationships. And then to suddenly realize that, no, this is the truth, was a big paradigm shift for me. I'd like for you to elaborate on this truth, why it is the truth.
Okay. Thank you. So The question, I understand everything you're saying. It's not, it might feel like it's a lot. For me, it's not a lot. Um, Now, just to start off, I try not to talk about this subject too much, first of all. Now, you will see I do talk about it, you know, but my predisposition, if that makes sense, is to not talk about this too much because it's a very radical teaching and it can be quite polarizing. And what I want to do is bring people to the teachings, and more than that, I want to help bring people to realization. Okay. Sometimes that means talking about this stuff, but sometimes it means not talking about it too much because it can really put people off the teaching. Before we started this podcast, I don't know if you include that in or not, but we mentioned that my guru is Ramana Maharshi. And he used to say, don't worry about these questions too much. His advice was, and again, it maybe for some people he would go into it more because it depends on the person. But generally, don't worry about these questions too much. Is the world real? Is the world unreal? Is the world distinct from consciousness, or is it one with consciousness, or is it something else? Is there free will? Is there no free will, or something else? He said, don't worry about these questions too much. Instead, divert your attention inwards towards the I am, towards your true nature, towards yourself. Do self-inquiry and discover the truth for yourself. And then you don't get into too much argumentation or philosophizing. And one way of putting it is, instead of arguing or listening to other people argue about what Paris looks like and you not being sure, just go to Paris yourself. It might be a long journey for you. It might be an arduous journey, but at least you'll find out for yourself. Whereas talking about it in words may be helpful to a point, but ultimately we've got to leave where we are and go to Paris. The metaphor is we should discover what we are in our own experience. And then all these questions are answered without any argument. Because lots of times we try and explain the same things, but we might explain it in different ways. And then people listening to people's words about this may take it too literally and so on and so on. So that's just like a disclaimer at the beginning, or a preface to like my attitude towards this kind of thing. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. You want people to, and that is a goal, to reach the realization, not just become, intellectual words, or philosophy. It
Yeah.
should be experiential. But definitely for me, the knowledge and studying has helped me personally, to also experience it. Like when I sit down for meditation, I feel like that knowledge and that gyan that I have studied essentially becomes experiential. I don't know if that's something that
Yeah.
happens with people, but
Of course it does. Of course. And that's why these scriptures are there, and that's why these texts are there. And that's why, what you're saying is a wonderful thing. Um, can I, so you said that when you came across the doctrine of non-origination, which I assume is your translation or a translation of ajata. Jata means birth or creation. And ajata, is the negating prefix. So ajata means no birth or no creation. When translated, sometimes people translate it as non-origination. But this is a technical term. Much easier to say no creation or nothing, no arising, nothing being created. When you said that when you came across this is very useful for you. Can you explain to me why it was so useful for you? And then that will help me um, help me in the way I explain things to you.
Of course. So, for me, I guess, well, maybe I can also kind of generalize for a lot of the youth. We think about the future, about our success, the amount of fame we'll get, the amount of money we'll earn, the relationships we'll have, what people will think of us, because we are thinking from the limited, I guess, perception that we are just this mind body, that I, as Amira, exist alone. I'm somehow special and unique. I'm not talking about like low or high self-esteem here. I'm just talking about that perception of like myself, right? And all of us probably have that when we are ignorant or are in that process. So for me, that was actually very suffocating. Um, when I began the process of self-inquiry, I kept on asking myself, like, why am I suffering? All these things I've named are external things, external factors or situations, but logically they shouldn't really be affecting me. Why am I getting affected by these, which is resulting in suffering? And I realize that because I'm associating them with something called Amira, like a name that my parents put on my birth certificate, and this body and mind, which, to be honest, I didn't really have anything to do with in the first place. And when death first came to my understanding, I began to realize, like, what is dying? You're burning a body, something that is perishable, right? So, am I really the mind, the intellect, or the body? So that question started to come, and I began to link a lot of my suffering with that perception of myself as this finite being. When that realization started to come that I am not this finite being, I am that infinite consciousness, I don't know, a freedom came. I'm still doing everything I need to do, but I feel very liberated, as if I'm not, the bondages were just essentially an imagination that I created, because of conditioning or ignorance or whatever, past life, whatever you want to call it. But those bondages weren't really even there in the first place. So the doctrine of non-origination for me gave me this understanding that my true nature, doesn't really, you know, have birth or die. It is just a body. Maybe if in some way enlightenment is not reached in this lifetime, or I don't realize my true nature, I may come back in another costume or human form or whatever that may look like. But I, as consciousness, don't die. For me, that's very liberating, even in psychology. So I am actually going to be starting my PhD in psychology next year, and I'm doing my applications now. And as I'm studying, I am realizing that even in psychology, like, it's stated that the reason we chase fame is because, in a way, we have a denial of death, because we, in a way, think we are mortal and we're going to die, so we want to build this legacy, right? And so all those concepts are placed upon us because of the ignorance of our true self. I hope that gave a little bit of clarity of my mindset
Yeah.
and why this teaching has helped me.
Yes. No. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. And that's great to hear about that you've been doing this PhD. That's awesome. Amazing. I'm sure it's going to be an amazing PhD as well. I'd be interested to see how that comes along. Um, so for you, ajata means non-origination. That for you, ajata means that the self was never born and never dies. Is that correct?
In my understanding, yes. The self, the true self, yes.
True self, yeah, not the body, mind, or the ego. Okay. So traditionally and classically, that is not the meaning of ajata. Okay. Ajata doesn't mean that the self is not born, does not die. Now, it is true that the self is not born and does not die, but that's not what ajata means in the Vedanta teachings. Nor in the Buddhist teachings, we have the same word used, ajata. It also doesn't mean that. So there are lots of different forms of Vedanta that have arisen over time. And they all say that the self is without birth and without death. Is not born, does not die. It's the immortal, the eternal self. But not all of them agree that ajata is the highest truth, which we see in Mandukya Upanishad, we see in Gaudapada's commentaries. And Gaudapada in 4 chapters. He's written commentaries in 4 chapters. He goes to great length to explain what he means by ajata and what he doesn't mean by ajata. So what you're talking about, I think, is a beautiful message for everyone to hear. Ajata is a very difficult, radical message to hear. And that's why I tend not to talk about that too much. I'm worried that I've now blown it. I've actually just sort of hyped it
I
up.
know. I'd love for you actually to go into the radical teaching as well, because a lot of our viewers are actually, I don't want to say serious piece, but they want to know the
Yeah.
truth. So I'd love
Okay.
for you to explore that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Have you heard of Shristi Dristi Vada, Dristi Shristi Vada, Vivarta Vada, Ajata Vada? Have you heard of these things?
I've heard of them, yes.
Okay. So these are like the 3 levels of the teaching. There are they're different levels of the teaching, but broadly speaking, we could say there are 3 levels of the teaching. And they broadly correspond to the 3 main schools of Vedanta. Broadly, okay. The first, so the original Vedanta, in my opinion, is Advaita Vedanta. This is the oldest form of Vedanta. It wasn't called Advaita Vedanta. It was just called Vedanta, and it taught Advaita. Yeah. Later on, there were a group of intellectuals and devotees who couldn't accept the radical. This is my view, by the way. They wouldn't say this. Um, a group of devotees and intellectuals who couldn't accept the radical nature of the Vedanta teachings proclaiming Advaita. And so they came up with 2 other schools, Dvaita, which means dualistic, and Vishishtadvaita, which doesn't have a decent translation. People translate it as qualified non-duality. I think a better translation is partial non-duality. Okay.
Is that
And
the sorry to chime in, but is that the school where, like in duality, the general understanding is that me and God are separate, right? There's or duality or me. There is a separation, right? Non-dual means
exactly.
one. Vishish Advaita is I am part of it, or in some
That's it,
sense.
exactly. That's exactly it. So the Advaita basically says you are God. You are that. Tattvamasi. You are that. Yeah. And in Chandogya Upanishad, for example, there's a whole series of verses where the father tells his son, you are that. The father's the teacher, teaching Vedanta to his son. And in one of those examples, he says, before the universe was created, you were there. And you gave rise to the entire universe, the entire material world, the body, the mind, all the bodies, all the minds, all the worlds that ever existed. You were there prior to that, and you gave rise to all these things, and they will go back into you. You are that which was there prior to the arising. Okay. You are literally God. Yeah. You are the creator, the sustainer, the destroyer, and you are fundamentally that which is prior to those even arising. Okay. This is what the Upanishads say. In my mind, they say it very clearly. Some people couldn't accept that. It's too radical. And so they came up with Vishishtadvaita, which is, I call it partial non-duality, which means there is this God and we are one with that God, but we are not the same as that God. We are a part that God, we are one with that God, but we're not the same. Now, I am grossly simplifying it. There's all these complex terms and Sanskrit terms. There's huge amounts of commentary. So I'm grossly simplifying it. And that they would claim that that's the true meaning of Vedanta. I say that's a distortion of teaching. And actually, if you read the text, you can see it's a distortion in my view. But there you go. That's my view. And then there's the dualistic, which actually, as you say, they say, well, fundamentally, you and God are separate. Yeah, there's a duality. We're not the same. We'll never be the same. But we can attain some kind of liberation through God's blessing. So these are the 3 schools. They broadly correspond to 3 levels of the Vedanta teaching. because all these three teachings are in the Vedanta scriptures. But they're, the different levels of the teaching. So the first level of teaching assumes a materialistic paradigm, which is I'm a body-mind entity living in a world. And then I can pray to God, or I can devote myself to God, or I can do meditation practices, and eventually I can realize the self, and that will make me happy. But it's all about me as a body-mind entity. That's called Shristi Dristi Vada. Shristi Dristi Vada means that before I existed as a person, there was a universe there. There was a world there. Like if I'm born in the UK. So the UK existed. And then at one point in time, Tom was born in the UK. And prior to Tom being born, the UK was there. That kind of thing. So it's the materialistic paradigm. What's often called in philosophy realism, philosophical realism. Then there's a second paradigm, which is Dristi Shristi Vada. And then we're going to get onto ajata Vada, because we have to understand the other two to understand what ajata is. So Shristi Dristi Vada is the materialist or realist paradigm. If we swap those two words around, Dristi Shristi Vada, this is the spiritual paradigm. This is the idea that consciousness is primary. That consciousness was there first. And then in consciousness, the world, the body, mind appears and disappears and goes back into consciousness. Whereas the Shristi Dristi paradigm is that the world was there first, and consciousness then at some point in time emerges in a point in time and then disappears, like maybe after millions of years of evolution, when there was no life, and then there was unicellular organisms, and there's multicellular organisms, and then suddenly consciousness arose from the brain of some of these organisms. You wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. I just wanted to ask a quick question about the second stage, where you said that these things are an appearance in consciousness. Is that the Sankhya view, or is that I know that's a different school, but are those teachings similar? Because in my understanding, Sankhya is I mean, I don't know if in a way it is considered still duality, because when you are saying something is an appearing in consciousness, like something like an emotion, even like fear, is an appearing in Brahman or consciousness, but there is still a separation. So my question is that the same, or?
No, I'm not actually talking about Sankhya in this at all, because just to keep it simple, Sankhya is a separate school to both yoga and Vedanta. But in reality, we see all these traditions, there's lots of cross-fertilization of ideas. For example, many of what are now considered Vedanta concepts come from Sankhya and yoga and vice versa. So many Vedantins consider Sankhya to be a dualistic school. But within Sankhya adherents, there's a whole, some will insist in non-duality, some will insist in duality. It gets very complicated, or there are lots of different views on all these different things. So Sankhya can fit into actually any of these three views, because within Sankhya, there are different people who believe different things, just as within Vedanta, there are different people who believe different things. Okay. But I think most Vedantins would say that Sankhya is dualistic, because these schools, they like to say the other ones are not as good as them, right? So this is typically what you'll see. In my view, probably there is a way to realization in all these schools, really. They're all trying in their own way to say the same essential thing. They all come from the Vedas, these orthodox schools, these darshanas, these orthodox ways of seeing. Darshan means seeing. So they call them the philosophical schools, or the Vedic philosophical schools, but they're just different ways of seeing or saying. So we have this second one, which is Dristi Shristi Vada, which is consciousness is primary. And what we call matter is something that arises within consciousness, as consciousness, and then goes back into consciousness, you see? Now, in when it comes to Vedanta, whether you have a realist paradigm or this Dristi Shristi paradigm, which can be called philosophical idealism, which is that everything is consciousness or everything is mind, in Western philosophy, they might say. In both these ideas, there's the idea that there is an immortal part of yourself that is timeless. Okay? What you are calling ajata. Everyone, if they think that I am a body mind and I will attain realization, they think they'll attain realization of the birthless, deathless self. Whether they're Dristi Shristi or Shristi Dristi Vada, you see. So what is ajata Vada? Ajata Vada is something very unique, very, very strange. We see it in many traditions, actually. It's not that unique, but it's very rare, I should say. Ajata Vada says that in truth there is one. There is one thing. You can't actually explain what it is. But let's call it Atman, the self, or let's call it Brahman, the absolute. Doesn't matter what you call it. There's one thing. You are that. And in that, nothing ever appeared. There was never a world. There was never a body. There was never a mind that appeared at all. There was no creation. That means nothing was ever created, not even as an appearance. So in the rope and the snake analogy, which I understand your viewers are aware of, the Ajatavada teaching is that the snake never appeared in the first place, and never even appeared to appear. It was never seen. This is the Ajatavada teaching. Whereas Dristi Shristi says the snake appears, but it appears due to ignorance or illusion. Ajatavada says there was never any appearance, there was never any ignorance even at all, and never any duality at all. So that's the Ajatavada.
A quick question that emerges from that in Ajatavada with the rope and snake analogy. Logically, it makes sense that there was never any snake at all. It was only the rope that existed. Kind of similar to us saying that it was only consciousness or Brahman that existed, nothing at all. But isn't it also accurate to say that the reason we think otherwise is due to ignorance or error?
Yes, that is the Dristi Shristi Vada teaching you've given. Okay? And what it does, it accepts that ignorance came or appeared to come along. And this is why we appear to see the snake in the rope when there is actually no snake, right? It's also called Vivarta Vada, which goes a bit further than Dristi Shristi. Vivarta Vada basically means everything you see is an illusion. Okay? And it says the reason we see an illusion is because of ignorance. So it's basically saying the snake isn't real. It's an illusion. It's an illusory appearance like a dream. Yeah. This is the Dristi Shristi Vada or Vivarta Vada teaching. I have written an article on this. On my website, tomdas.com, there are a whole series of introductory articles. And one of them is called I can't remember what it's called, the 3 theories of reality, according to Sri Ramana Maharshi, where he goes through and explains this. And I put lots of quotes in there. Not lots, I put a few quotes in there just so you can flesh it out. You can read it in your own time. You can think about it. But it makes sense. The thing about Dristi Shristi and Shristi Dristi teachings, they make sense. We understand them. They make complete sense. The rope and the snake makes sense. Everyone can understand that. But what doesn't make sense is that there was never a snake and no one ever saw a snake and ignorance never came about in the first place. That is what Ajata says. It's distinct from the other 2 types of teaching. It doesn't admit of ignorance ever having arisen in the first place or any possibility of it arising. And Gaudapada goes to lengths to show how ignorance could never arise or never even appear to arise. Whereas Vivartavada says it can't arise, but it does appear to arise because of ignorance. Do you see the difference?
I'm going to definitely take your time to get a little bit of a clear understanding on this. Reason being because for me personally, as I am still studying this, and when I listen, I read Gaurapada's Karakas and understand them, he takes us through in a very nice way of kind of first separating the dreaming, waking, deep sleep state and showing us how first, how those are three separate, and kind of just like, if I am dreaming, I get into an accident in the dream, I wake up, I'm still on my bed, right? It's not like I've actually moved. I wake up, I realize, thank God it wasn't a dream, it wasn't real. And similarly, we can see that in the waking state, right? If we know that our true state is turiya or consciousness, and this waking state, the way we are perceiving it so real and seriously, that is not the case. And even in deep sleep, consciousness, awareness is still there, but the mind is not working. So that obviously helps me understand how, to essentially make like similarities between each state. Then he goes on to saying that this distinction between the dreaming, waking, deep sleep is also not true. It's not three. We call it Turiya the fourth, but in actuality, it is just one. All right. Um, I think
Tell
for
me,
me,
tell me more about that. Tell me more about that last bit, your understanding.
my understanding is kind of like, I think you use this example as well, right? Like when we are, if I go out for a run right now, my heartbeat will rise. Like there will be a lot of physiological, biological changes. It's not like that's a different state. It's still kind of classified right in the waking state. So similarly, saying that those three, dreaming, deep, and waking state, are separate from consciousness or turiya itself, is also not accurate, because it is all happening within consciousness itself.
The problem we have with reading Gaudapada is that he's very radical. And many people, when they translate him, they can't believe what he's written is actually what he's written. So they translate it and they change the meaning of the words to suit their understanding. This is natural when we translate something. If someone says something, it doesn't quite make sense, we try and make it make sense for the viewer or the listener. So when you read Gaudapada, you have to be careful which translation you're reading, because some of the people who are translating it themselves don't understand the radical nature of the teaching. Gaudapada argues that you have these states, the dream state, the waking state. And he argues that these two are actually the same. He says there's a dream state, there's a waking state. These two are the same. Then he says there's this deep sleep state. Actually, if you understand the nature of deep sleep, by the way, this is not what most Vedanta teachers do not teach what I'm sharing with you now. And some do, but most do not, especially the more popular ones. So if you read the scriptures, it is actually very clear. Especially Gaudapada, he's extremely clear in what he's saying. You may have to dig into some of the Sanskrit to see the clarity, because the what's his name? And there's a Swami whose name begins with GH from Advaita Ashrama, who has done quite a good translation of Mandukya Upanishad. Hold on, let me just get a copy. Sure. This is a relatively good version. Okay, it's translated by Swami Gambhirananda, and it's got Shankara's commentary. So what happened? You got the Mandukya Upanishad, and then you got, as you know, you got Gaudapada's commentary on Mandukya Upanishad, and then you got Shankara's commentary on Gaudapada's commentary. And Shankara was, as you probably know, his guru's guru was Gaudapada. Yeah,
Dada Guru,
yeah, exactly. His guru was Govinda, and Govinda's guru, we think, is Gaudapada. So, and Shankara, if you read Shankara's commentary, he explains all this too. When you go into when the deep sleep state is actually turiya. Okay, often the way you'll hear it described is there are three states: waking, dream, deep sleep, and then turiya is the consciousness which pervades all these three. And
right.
So throughout these three, there's a constant of turiya. But if you read Gaudapada, that's not what he's saying. And that's not the ajata teaching. Okay. Gaudapada is saying that the three states, two of them, dream and waking, are the same. And deep sleep, when you inquire into it, that is actually the self. This is why in verse 7 of the Mandukya Upanishad you read to us right at the start, it says it's the cessation of all phenomenal arisings. which means the cessation of the dream and the cessation of the waking states. That is Turiya. You see, phenomenal risings only occur in waking and dream. And in Turiya, there is no outward going consciousness, meaning no waking or dream. Well, actually, he says there's no outward going consciousness, which refers to waking. No inward going consciousness, by which he means the dream. Because he doesn't use the words outwards and inward going consciousness. He uses the technical terms for dreamer and waker. The translation translates it that way, but actually he uses the technical words in that verse. And he also says, it is not the ignorance of deep sleep. There is something else which you are, in which all phenomena cease. And that is what you have to realize. That is ajata. Ajata means when there's no arising phenomena. That's the creation. It doesn't mean the self is not created, because all schools of Vedanta believe that. Even the ones that don't accept ajata. But the ones that accept ajata say that in truth, nothing ever happened. There's no arising at all, not even as an appearance. And this is what Gaudapada tries to explain in his 4 chapters.
I clearly remember studying and Gaudapada saying how, and he essentially says the waking and dreams state are the same. That I clearly remember. Now, I am still a little bit stuck on the deep sleep state. I told you what my understanding was before that, and I'm still a little bit confused about how that is. I don't know how you connected that to Turiya, but you're saying it's not the situation that deep sleep is also a state or in consciousness. Can you please explain that a little bit more? That's where I'm stuck.
Yeah, this is stuff, again, I tend not to talk about too much because it can get really technical. It's actually a very deep teaching. It's a very if it's given to the person at the right time, it's so liberating, because it's kind of like the missing piece that's missing from Vedanta teachings, is the way they're commonly taught. And, and we see this teaching also, we see the teaching of the 3 states and the teaching of deep sleep actually as being the self. We see it in the Mandukya Upanishad. We also see it in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which was written before Mandukya Upanishad. When people talk about 3 states, Mandukya Upanishad is quite famous for talking about the 3 states. But actually, this teaching's given before Mandukya Upanishad in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is probably the first of the Upanishads. It's also the longest. And all the essential Vedanta teachings are given to us in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And we also have Shankara's commentary on this as well. If you want to read all this stuff, he explains how the self is actually deep sleep. And there's a section in Gaudapada's commentary where Gaudapada has to explain why, if that is the case, why falling asleep doesn't lead to liberation. I don't know if you remember reading that. There's a verse in Gaudapada's commentary where he says, falling asleep will not lead to liberation, and he explains why. The reason he has to explain why is because prior to that, he's equated deep sleep with liberation, you see. And that's why he has to then explain why falling asleep doesn't lead to liberation. Now, if you read the wrong translation, it doesn't come through because the translator hasn't translated it properly. But if you read a literal translation, where you just, if you can probably use ChatGPT now. I mean, I read these things a couple of decades ago. But if you get a literal translation, you'll see it's very clear. If you get an interpretive translation, it gets lost through the interpretation. What am I talking about deep sleep being the self? Deep sleep is, see, there's actually a lot I could say on this if you wanted.
I would really want to. I feel like it would help
Yeah.
people and also myself
Okay.
as also. Because I am going to end up after this podcast restudy a lot and continue my study. So
First of all, everything I'm saying we can discover for ourselves. That is really important to state, because it can sound like I'm just talking from a scriptural knowledge. And I'm not. I'm talking from my own direct experience. But it just so happens that I have read a lot of these scriptures as well. When you read them and you have the understanding, they all become clear. But when you don't have the understanding, it's very easy to distort them. And I used to distort them as well. When I first read these, I distorted them. And then when you have the realization that, oh, that's what they were actually trying to say. Deep sleep is often spoken of as a state of profound ignorance where we know nothing. Knowing nothing is the definition of absolute ignorance. Because ignorance literally means not knowing. In Sanskrit, it's avidya. Vidya means knowledge, avidya means no knowledge. And we translate that word avidya as ignorance. So ignorance means not knowing. It means no gnosis. No, the Greek word gnosis, spelled Gnosis. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. And agnosis, agnostic, means no knowledge. This is where the word ignorance comes from. No knowledge. So deep sleep, and the Upanishads say this as well. The Upanishads say deep sleep is total ignorance. So that's a lower teaching. And it's in the Upanishads. Shankara gives it. All the Vedanta scriptures, not all of them, but a lot of them give it. Some of the Vedanta scriptures give us higher teachings. Some of the Upanishads give us higher teachings. Not all the Upanishads give us the same level of teaching. Some go deeper in some places and some don't. Some go deeper in the method of how to attain realization, some don't. They all point to the same thing, but they do it in slightly different ways and to slightly different depths. In some places, the Upanishads tell us that deep sleep actually is the self, it's the true self. But because of ignorance, we consider it to be a state of nothingness. So from the point of view of the waking state, deep sleep, it appears to be a state of ignorance. But actually, if we inquire into ourselves, we'll see what deep sleep actually is our true nature. It's bliss. It's total happiness and bliss. Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi gave us this teaching as well. And there's an article I've written on this. I think it's called Deep Sleep and Self-Realization, I think it's called. And it's also called How Not to Fall Asleep During Self-Inquiry or something like that. And we see this teaching in Bhagavad Gita as well in the second chapter of deep sleep. It's given very cryptically in the Bhagavad Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says that which is daytime for the ignorant is nighttime for the wise. And then vice versa. I'm going to mess it up. It's like that which is daytime for the wise is nighttime for the ignorant. And they're pointing at deep sleep as being our true nature. So why is it that it's said that deep sleep is not our true nature? Well, they say in deep sleep there is this primal ignorance there, the seed of ignorance there. They call it the causal body. Have you heard this teaching?
Yeah, so when in deep sleep is essentially basically the mind is not working, right? It's not active. So it's like the seed state, which is why when we wake up, then that seed grows into what we see as the world.
So this is a rational, logical teaching given to a lower level aspirant seeker to explain to them the three states. They say, well, in deep sleep, the mind goes into a dormant seed state. It's not there, but it's kind of there in potential form. Yeah. And the language they use is that of agriculture because that's when these scriptures are written. They don't say it was there in potential form because they didn't have the word potential widely used. They said it was in seed form. Seed means potential. It's a metaphor for potential. So they call it the causal body, the seed body, the dormant ego. Now, they say the causal body is more subtle than the mind. So how does anyone know of this causal body? Let me ask you, Amira. How does anyone know this causal body is there? No one can see it because it's too subtle to be seen. They say it's too subtle for the mind and the senses, the causal body. There's no mind in deep sleep, right? So how does anyone know about the causal body? No one's ever seen it. You see, it's basically, this is going to sound a bit harsh, it's basically a made-up teaching to placate the minds of seekers who just want a logical explanation. Okay. And Bhagavan Ramana explains this when he talks to devotees about this. He says, this is not a true teaching. It's just a lower level teaching just to satisfy the minds of people who want an explanation. They're given this explanation. The scriptures are full of this, by the way. There are loads of different theories of creation of the universe. They can't all be true. The Vedas has dozens of ways that explains dozens of ways the universe is created. Ultimately, the Vedas say it wasn't created. This is ajata. So all these different levels of creation theory are there just to placate the minds of the seeker at their different levels. You know? But ultimately, we will discover there was no universe. There was only that, and you are that. So this idea of there being a causal body and the mind in some sort of dormant seed state is not verifiable through experience. The whole idea of causal body is a teaching that's put in there to give symmetry, like there are three states, there are three bodies, you know. There's the gross body for the waking state, there's a subtle body for the dream state, and then, okay, let's have a causal body for the deep sleep state. But when you go deeper into the teachings, they'll say, actually, deep sleep is the cell. Like it's called, in the Upanishads, it's called Jagrat Shushupti. Have you heard this phrase?
Yes, I have.
They call it, Jagrat means the waking state. Shushupti means a deep sleep state. Jagrat Shushupti is when you go into the deep sleep state fully conscious. That results in self-realization.
I don't know if I don't know if I missed this, but the reason why, I know Gauravada obviously explains this, but then why don't we, when we go into deep sleep, and again, there's no way to verify it, but then why aren't we quote unquote enlightened? So does that have to do with the fact that because it's technically that ignorance is there, or why doesn't it happen then?
Yeah, so the explanation that's typically given is that yes, the reason we don't become enlightened because the mind, the ignorance is still there in some seed form. Yeah, that's the simple explanation that's given by Vedanta typically. Yeah, the truth is we cannot understand deep sleep. All our understanding of deep sleep is from the waking state only. Yeah, which is ignorance. The waking states and dream states, like Gaudapada tells us that these are ignorance. These are superimposition. Yeah, these are ignorance. These are a result of thoughts. The mind wavers and projects the waking state or the dream state. Yeah, and when the mind is still and goes back to the self, then that's realization. So he gives an explanation, but there is actually we cannot really fully explain why these things occur or don't occur, because we don't actually understand what deep sleep actually is. If we understand what deep sleep is, that's self-realization. We all think we know deep sleep. Everyone thinks, "Oh, I know sleep. I go to sleep every night." You know, it's this blank state. There's nothing to see here, like a big sign, nothing to see here. Yeah, deep sleep. So when we're looking for liberation, where do we look? Which of the three states do we look in? Well, 99.9% of people are looking for liberation in the waking state. There are a few people who are looking for liberation in the dream state. You know, they'll do some dream yoga or some dream work, you know. But most people don't even bother looking in the deep sleep state. Vedanta says, deep sleep, there's a profound truth here. That is your true nature, is deep sleep. Everyone goes, well, that's not very desirable. Well, that's why they don't shout it from the rooftops, because that's the surefire way to put people off your teaching, is by saying what you truly are is deep sleep. Yeah, because everyone's interested in waking, and some people are interested in dream because of ignorance. But once we start realizing our true nature is deep sleep, we go to it every evening, every night, let's say. if we go into deep sleep consciously, then we realize the self. The reason we don't realize it when we go to sleep, that's given, which if you examine also doesn't make sense, but I'll give you the reason that's given, is basically when we fall asleep at night, we go into it unconsciously. And that's why we don't realize the self when we fall asleep, because we go into it unconsciously. But if we go into it consciously, then we will realize the self. When we go into it consciously, this is called Nididhyasana in Vedanta. If you look up Nididhyasana, you'll see that very few Vedanta teachers explain what Nididhyasana properly is, as written in the scriptures. You will see many teachers tell you what Nididhyasana is, but find scriptural support for it. Nididhyasana is when you go into your deep sleep state consciously. It's also known as Jagrat Sushupti.
I wasn't aware of that. For me, Nididhyasana, the simple kind of definition of it was the process of, contemplating and just kind of going through the teachings again to try to make it your own.
Nowhere in the scriptures does that say that is Nididhyasana. Nowhere. Yeah, this is why I'm saying that most of the Vedanta teachings you will hear, unfortunately, they bear some resemblance to the scriptures, of course, but when you go deeper, you'll see there's a lot missing. Contemplating and revolving those teachings such as I am that's manana. Yeah. So what you've heard is Nididhyasana is actually manana. Manana means reflecting upon the teachings. Nididhyasana is something different. Nididhyasana is when you take your attention, and Shankara calls it like reversing the stream of the current, away from the sense organs, away from the sense objects, towards the I am within. Our attention is flowing outwards. When we take it inwards, we discover deep sleep within ourselves. Yeah, so this is Turiya. And this is what Gaudapada and Mandukya Upanishad are pointing to. That's why it says the cessation of all phenomena. Yeah, there's no arising of phenomena in deep sleep. In deep sleep, your consciousness is there, but there is no projecting or veiling power present. There is no ego projecting the dream or waking state. There is just this third state. There are actually only two states, you see. There's a state of self-knowledge and the state of ignorance. Ignorance, the state of self-knowledge is called the self or deep sleep. And the state of ignorance is called waking or dream, which are the same. There are only two states. And there's actually only one state, which is the self. When you say there are two states, that is dristi, shristi, vada. Sorry if this is making it too complex.
Oh, it's very helpful.
And when you say there's only one state, that is ajata vada. That means there was never a waking state, never a dream state. This is what Gaudapada explains. And one thing I've done on my website is I've actually translated Shankara writes an introduction to Mandukya Upanishad in his commentary. And I've translated it from the Sanskrit. It's a lot of work to translate the whole thing. But I've translated the introduction. And this version is actually pretty good. But I've just translated to make it more accessible and slightly more accurate, in my opinion, in some areas. You can see it for free on tomdas.com. Shankara's introduction to Mandukya Upanishad, when he explains a lot of this. But yeah, even this translation I recall is very clear. I haven't read it for a few years, but this is the Swami Gabirananda translation.
From Advaita Ashram, right?
Yeah, from Advaita Ashram, Kolkata, Ramakrishna lineage,
Heard of the book.
Yeah, I mean, Swami Sarvapriyananda is in that lineage. But different Swamis in this lineage translate these texts differently according to their understanding, right? But what this Swami has done, he's translated it very literally, and he has a very deep understanding as well. You can see by the way when he writes his own comments, you can see he's got a very deep understanding. But check out my article on deep sleep realization. You see Bhagwan Ramana's thoughts on it too. Ramana makes all these complicated teachings incredibly simple. Yeah, he just takes all these teachings, he makes it very simple, but without dumbing it down, without taking away the liberating potential. Because we can simplify teachings, but we can also render them ineffective by making them simple. But what Bhagwan Ramana does is he makes them very simple, but also maintains their effectiveness. And that way you don't have to read all this stuff, to be frank, because this is a pain to read. It's written 1,500 years ago, And I don't know about you, but if you like in English, we have Shakespeare. That was written like 400 years ago. And it's already quite difficult to read for someone like me, But you were trying to read Sanskrit from 1,500 years ago. It's not the easiest thing to understand. Their idioms, their way they use language, the cultural references, often it's lost.
Right. Yeah, that's what's important to the best of the ability, have a good interpretation, translation, and a teacher can kind of explain that in an understandable way. I was about to ask you, which now I don't think the question is relevant, about why did we forget our true nature in the first place? How can consciousness forget who it is? But in Ajatavada teaching, that's not even a relevant question. But I do want to ask you just to elaborate a little bit more on so because we are specifically talking about the doctrine of non-origination, if I give you like a specific situation and you can kind of relate it to this teaching. So basically, let's say there is some type of devastating tragic event, a tsunami, a flood that kills a lot of people. Now, to be able to view that as an appearance in consciousness is still something that is doable, to see that it is a impermanent event that doesn't have its own independent existence. It came, it will go, and things will get better. But to be able to see that as Brahman or consciousness itself is difficult. So can you like practically explain that, like for the example that I give? How does the Jatavada teaching fit in?
Okay. Sorry. Sorry, I'm laughing. The thing is, Ajata, just to answer your question straightforwardly, according to Ajata, it never happened. It's never happened. There's no tsunami, there's no devastation, there's no people. That's why Gaudapada's famous verse on Ajata is it's something like, there is no creation, there is no teacher, there's no teaching, there's no seeker, there's no one striving for liberation, there's no liberation, right? You know that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's taken from the Upanishads. There's two separate Upanishads which have that verse in it. Amrita Bindu Upanishad is one. I think, is it Adhyatma Upanishad is another one, I think. And Shankara's written this verse. It's in Vivekachudamani, one of Shankara's works as well. It basically says nothing has actually happened. It's just an illusion. Gaudapada said it's like the firebrand. It's like the whirling of the stick, or like an incense stick at night time. You whirl it, you see some shapes, but then it never happened really. But Ajatavada goes further than that. See, what you're talking about is Dristi Shristi Vada. Dristi Shristi Vada is the idea that everything is arising in consciousness and it's just an appearance in consciousness. The problem with Dristi Shristi Vada, the reason why Ajatavada is so important to someone who is at that level where they need that teaching, is that only Ajatavada is truly liberating. As long as Dristi Shristi Vada can reduce suffering, but it will not end suffering. So Dristi Shristi Vada is like, say there's a terrible thing happening in the world. Famine, war, death, destruction, awful things happening. It's saying, well, it is all one with myself. It is all appearance in consciousness. Yeah. Now, if you're honest, this may alleviate suffering somewhat. You might say it's all like a dream. Yeah. But it's not very satisfactory because it's still happening. Even if it's just a dream, it's still quite distressing. You know, if you're watching your loved ones or just human beings suffering and horrible things happening to them, it's pretty distressing. It's not liberating. It might help you a bit on some level. You say, well, it's God's plan, or there's a reason why this is happening, or, it's all for the greater good. But then the part is like, well, why is God allowing all this evil and horrible stuff to happen? So it's not very satisfactory. It's not a satisfactory teaching. And Gaudapada Shankara, they understand this is unsatisfactory. Yeah, it's still dukkha. Dukkha means suffering or unsatisfactory. The only truly liberating teaching is when you discover the truth of ajata. And when you discover the truth of ajata, you realize nothing ever, you don't even realize that is wrong. There's no you left. You don't even exist anymore as a person. There is no body. There is no mind. There is no world. This is the ajata teaching. And in liberation, that is realized. But prior to liberation, we have these other views, such as dristi, shristi, shristi, dristi, and we try and make the best of them, but they will never be satisfactory. This is what the Vedanta teaching tells us. It's what Gaudapada goes to great lengths to tell us.
Because to be able to, in the drishti approach, when we say that, like in the example that I used of a tsunami or famine, that it is a temporary arising, right? That it is temporary, it doesn't, it's not permanent, and then also to realize that it doesn't have its independent existence without consciousness. So that helps, but like you said, it doesn't. It kind of helps for a limited time, but not fully.
Yeah, it's like imagine someone punched someone else in the face, and they said, "Well, it's just temporary. You'll get better." It's like, well, that's not very satisfactory, is it? It's God's will. All is happening was God's will. So I punched you in the face. It's not very liberating. I mean, it might be more it might be better to have that view. And it might help you personally to have that view, or it might hinder you. Actually, it could hinder you personally. You see, there's a teaching in the Upanishads about that the Upanishads use very simple language of their time. They're not using technical language. You can see that because you can see the authors have a huge control, a huge. They are able to use language incredibly eloquently, to great ability. They're able to. The people who wrote the rishis who wrote the Upanishads and the Vedanta scriptures, they have a very powerful ability to use the language they are using. But you can see they deliberately keep the language simple, so everyone can understand. These texts are designed to be read by normal, everyday people. That's why there are all these metaphors that are used that are quite simple, like rope and snake. Everyone can understand. They're not using technical terms. So one of the terms they use is real and unreal. Sat means real and asat means unreal, for example. There are other words they use as well. And real means something that exists. Yeah. In fact, the word sat means real, and it also means existence. And asat means that which doesn't exist. And this is what the terms mean in Vedanta. But what's happened recently, mainly in the 20th century, is that teachers have said, well, in Vedanta, real means that which is permanent, and unreal means that which is temporary. Whereas we never see that in the Vedanta scriptures at all. We never see that definition given anywhere in the Vedanta scriptures. They say the opposite. They say, if you investigate, you will discover that which is temporary doesn't exist. And that which truly exists is permanent, which is different to saying unreal just means temporary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that in Gaudapada, when like there's a place where he mentions the definition of temporary, or I guess if someone kind of asks a question, if Gaudapada was alive and someone was to ask him the question that if something is temporary, right, it doesn't have a beginning or end. That's kind of right. but doesn't it have a middle, right? Like it still exists for a short period of time, according to the definition of temporary. But I think Gaudapada would say that something that is temporary does not exist at all, because neither does it have a beginning or end, but it doesn't have a middle either. Like something that doesn't have a start or finish can never even exist anywhere in between.
Exactly. Yeah, that's well. What he's saying is that my understanding and my recollection, I might be thinking of a different teaching to what you're saying, but what he's saying is that something that is unreal in the beginning and unreal in the end is also unreal in the middle. That's what he's saying. Yeah. So he's saying, look, these things are unreal in the beginning, they're unreal in the end. That means in between they never existed either. See, what Gaudapada is trying to do, he's trying to give a logical underpinning to some of the Vedanta teachings. Because in the Upanishads, there's not always a logic they try and give. They just give the teaching, but they're not always trying to give, they're not appealing to the rational mind necessarily. And what Shankara and Gaudapada do, they try and appeal to the rational mind of the day, because there were debates going on at that time and place among people who are using logic and reason to make their cases. So he's not making a philosophical point that things don't. He's just saying that that which is unreal is always unreal. It never comes into being. We see the same teaching in Bhagavad Gita when he says that which is unreal never came into being, and that which is real never ceases to be. This is a very famous verse in the Bhagavad Gita. I've done an article, by the way, on ajata in the Bhagavad Gita. So you can look that up as well on tomdas.com. And it goes through some of these verses in the Gita, which describe the ajata doctrine. Because many people don't realize that the Bhagavad Gita also contains ajata vada.
I do actually want to talk about one more thing. So because this episode was essentially based on this radical teaching of the doctrine of non-origination, Gaudapada, which I'm sure people will find helpful. But now when we are talking about this, like in this discussion, we went through a lot of like teachings from the scriptures, an intellectual, study, logical way to understand this. If someone has to really understand ajata, not understand it intellectually, I mean experientially realize it. Like we were talking about deep sleep, but we obviously cannot experience that. So how does one do that? Because there are a lot of approaches, right? When we have like the self-inquiry process, the Neti approach to come to this realization, and obviously it's very helpful. But how can one experience it? And I guess my second part of that question is that at the end, do you think it's an intuitive leap that we have to take to reach the realization? Or can it be done without that intuitive leap?
Yeah, you don't need an intuitive leap. You don't need an intuitive leap. You don't need any scriptural knowledge. You don't need to know anything about ajata teachings or Mandukya Upanishad. You don't need to know Sanskrit. You don't need to be intelligent. You don't need to have a keen intellect. You don't have to be able-bodied. The only thing you need for these teachings to work is you need to exist. And everyone has that already. Yeah, everyone exists. If you exist, then you can realize the self. You can realize your true nature. And there is only one way to do it, and there are many ways to this one way. This one way goes by different names. It's basically self-inquiry, self-surrender, the path of knowledge, the path of bhakti, path of love, which was my path. I wanted to realize the self through the path of knowledge, because I like studying and I like reading and I understand concepts quickly. That's what Tom is, relatively speaking, fairly good at. But actually, despite all my years of studying and practicing, I got nowhere pretty much. Not nowhere, but I didn't get to where I wanted to be. And then Bhagwan Ramana came into my life, and I fell in love with him. And this is what led me to my own personal realization, which is not personal. ultimately. It's universal. And this is when all these teachings came alive for me. Before that, I had my own interpretations, my own ideas. And then only then did I start to see the truth of what these scriptures were really pointing to. Afterwards, it's quite interesting. How to do it? All the scriptures, all the Vedanta scriptures and the early Buddhist scriptures, meaning the Pali Canon, they all give us the same method, essentially. And that is, somehow, either through knowledge or through love and devotion, we turn our attention away from the body, the mind, the world, the thoughts, the sense perceptions, towards this sense within us of I exist or I am. Okay? With love, with affection. And then what happens is that eventually our attention goes inwards to an extent where we discover what we truly are. Because our attention is our awareness. Our awareness is our desire and our love. And when we turn our attention, our love, our desire onto ourselves, then we discover what we are. And that's the only teaching. That is Nididhyasana. That is Nididhyasana. That's the only teaching you'll find really in the Upanishads. Now, in some Upanishads, it's given very clearly. And some Upanishads, it's hinted at. Because some Upanishads don't give a clear method for realization. They just describe the ultimate reality, or they describe aspects of the path. So it's there. And the same in the Buddhist teachings, you'll see. And again, I've written some articles on this on tomdas.com if people want to see. But even if you don't care about any of these articles or any of these scriptures, what happens is initially we look for happiness outside of ourselves. Through a process of spiritual growth and maturity, we start to realize one by one that none of these objects lead to happiness. Temporary happiness at best. And none of these will satisfy us. And eventually, we run out of objects. If we're intelligent, we run out of objects. If we're lucky, if by grace of God we run out of objects, maybe we never run out of objects and we keep on chasing happiness in objects. Eventually, we come to feel and sense that happiness comes from within, and our attention collapses in on itself and goes home. And this is called self-inquiry. And this is the only thing the Upanishads teach.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing that. And I can resonate with especially the last part of what you said. And I was about to ask you about the role of a master and a guru in one's spiritual realization, and also about the intersection between the path of bhakti, devotion, and jnana or knowledge. But I think you covered this as well in your last question, where you talked about how an intuitive leap is not necessary. But yes, for you, Tom, in this relative world, you thought you were on the path of knowledge. And I guess at the end of the day, we are distinguishing it between two different paths, but it is not really separate because it all combines into one. One last message you'd like to leave our audience that you think they would benefit from based on this discussion, or anything at all that's on your heart right now?
Well, if you're seeking, if you're interested in this stuff, you've just got to, I would highly recommend you follow your heart. By all means, read all this stuff. You'll learn a lot. Maybe. But if you never forget that it's not about this stuff, it's about something within you, and these scriptures, these teachers, these teachings, they're just trying to describe yourself and how to get back to yourself. Personally, this may not be true for others, the most effective teachings I've ever come across by a long way are the teachings of Ramana Maharshi. So if you resonate with that, I just highly encourage you to, have a look at his teachings. I've got a recommended reading list on tomdas.com, which is a whole load of, if you're interested in Vedanta, what you can read. If you're interested in Bhagavan Ramana, what you can read. And if you're not interested in Vedanta or Ramana, there's also some stuff you can read for people who are not interested in this sort of, that style of presentation. But don't forget, everything you need is within you. That's what I would say. Trust yourself. Trust yourself. If you feel like you need to find a teacher, find a teacher. If you feel like you don't need a teacher, then go with yourself. And of course, if you resonate with something I'm sharing, please reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Tom, once again for being here. This is one of the few episodes and podcasts that I personally learned from and resonated with. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mira. Thank you for having me here. And I hope we didn't get too intellectual with all this ajata stuff, but I hope it was useful for yourself and anyone watching, listening.
It definitely was, definitely.
What I'll do actually, if it's okay with you, I will send you the links to a few articles about this. That way people can see how Ramana has explained these teachings, how Krishna in the Gita explains these teachings, how the Upanishads explain these teachings, how Shankara explains these teachings. If people are interested, then those resources are all there for free, that I can signpost you towards if you're interested.
That would be really helpful.